Europe does not just run on electricity or markets, it runs on pipelines. Whoever controls the flow of gas can influence the options of entire countries. The real turning point in Europe's energy vulnerability started before 2022. This video explains how the hidden map under Europe became a map of power. In the late 1960s, Soviet planners set out to redraw Europe's energy map, not with ideology, but with steel and gas. The Bratsk-TVO pipeline, completed in 1968, became the first artery to pierce the Iron Curtain. Stretching 225 kilometers from Hronov in Czechoslovakia to Mauthausen in Austria, it was more than a feat of engineering. It was a contract, signed with Austria's state utility Verbund, that locked in 23 years of gas deliveries. Soviet state funds built the eastern segment, while Austrian and Czechoslovak banks financed the west. This hybrid of state power and commercial credit set a model that would outlast the Cold War itself. On December 22, 1974, the first 800 million cubic meters of Soviet gas surged into Austria in just 48 hours. That shipment was celebrated as a symbol of detente, but it also established a template: pipelines as instruments of both commerce and influence. The hard currency payments from Western Europe were a lifeline for the Soviet economy, buying technology and goods the planned system could not produce. In return, Western Europe gained steady, affordable fuel that would underpin its post-war industrial growth. The 1970s brought expansion. The Urengoy to Moscow to Western Europe trunk line, authorized in 1974, was built with a mix of Soviet capital and Western loans. German, French, and Italian banks provided credit, often tied to the use of Western compressors and pipe coating technology. When the first gas reached West Germany in 1978, it came not just through Soviet pipes, but with Western hardware and financing woven into every kilometer. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, these contracts and physical links had become so embedded that the new Russian state inherited both the infrastructure and the commercial logic. The pipeline network, designed by planners for a different era, became the backbone of Europe's energy system and a source of leverage that would shape decades of politics and industry to come. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Europe's gas network faced a test of continuity. The pipelines, contracts, and commercial logic built over decades did not dissolve with the old regime. Instead, on May 24, 1993, Russia established Gazprom as a state-owned corporate giant, inheriting the entire Soviet export apparatus. This wasn't just a change of name. Under the principle of state succession, every long-term supply contract, from Austria's 23-year deal to Germany's gas for oil swaps and France's pre-commitments, was formally transferred to Gazprom. The 1992 Moscow Declaration on Energy Cooperation, signed by Russia and its main European partners, locked in this legal handover. Unlike chaotic privatizations elsewhere, the gas sector preserved its command structure. Gazprom's 1993 corporate charter spelled out its role as both pipeline operator and exclusive exporter. The company not only controlled the flow of gas from Siberia to Europe, but also managed the technical, financial, and diplomatic machinery that kept the system running. Joint commissions, first set up in the late Soviet era to coordinate tariffs and maintenance, continued under Gazprom's oversight, now rebranded as the Gazprom European Gas Forum. This seamless transfer meant the architecture of power stayed intact. The same steel arteries carried gas across borders, and the same contracts bound European importers. Gazprom emerged as both the custodian of Soviet infrastructure and the architect of a new era of energy leverage. The legacy of state planning became the backbone of Russia's geopolitical influence in Europe, setting up the next phase of competition over who controlled the routes, the fees, and the future of the continent's energy security. For decades, Ukraine's pipeline grid acted as the main gateway for Russian gas into Europe. At its peak, this corridor carried nearly 80% of Gazprom's westbound exports, fueling factories from Slovakia to Italy and generating up to €4 billion a year in transit fees for Ukraine. The state company Naftogaz became a critical player, balancing its own energy needs with the demands of both Moscow and Brussels. But this concentrated flow created a single point of vulnerability. When disputes erupted, the consequences rippled across the continent in real time. In January 2006, a pricing standoff between Gazprom and Naftogaz triggered a sudden supply cut. Within hours, pressure dropped in pipelines crossing Slovakia, Hungary, and Austria. Eurostat recorded a 12% spike in spot gas prices. Flow data from the Joint Gas Coordination Center showed volumes at Ukraine's western border plunging from 19 to 13 billion cubic meters that month. The shock exposed how quickly a bilateral dispute could escalate into a European emergency. The crisis deepened in January 2009. This time, a new contract dispute halted almost all Russian gas transiting Ukraine for nearly 2 weeks. Temperatures in Central Europe hovered below freezing as storage reserves dwindled. Poland and Slovakia declared energy emergencies. The European Commission's crisis report labeled the incident a systemic shock, with average Russian gas deliveries to the EU dropping by nearly 40%. For Naftogaz, the loss of transit revenue was immediate. But the broader cost was strategic. Trust in the Ukrainian corridor had been shattered. Each crisis pushed European leaders to rethink their energy map. The search for alternative routes, bypasses that would dilute Ukraine's leverage, gained new urgency. But while new pipelines promised diversification, they also redrew the lines of dependency, setting the stage for the next contest over who would control the flow. Nord Stream 1 began pumping gas directly from Russia to Germany beneath the Baltic Sea in 2011, bypassing both Ukraine and Poland. The pipeline, operated by Nord Stream AG, a consortium led by Gazprom and German partners, delivered up to 55 billion cubic meters per year, enough to supply more than a quarter of Germany's annual demand. For Berlin, the project was a calculated bet. Direct access to Russian gas promised stable prices and a reliable feedstock for German industry, especially chemicals and manufacturing. German officials argued that cutting out transit states would insulate Europe from political disputes and supply shocks. But that logic met fierce resistance in Warsaw, Vilnius, and Kyiv. Eastern European governments warned that Nord Stream would drain Ukraine's transit revenue and expose the EU to single-route blackmail. Poland's 2011 parliamentary report called the pipeline a strategic risk, arguing that route control handed Moscow a powerful lever over the entire region. The European Commission's legal analysis echoed these concerns, questioning whether the project undermined collective energy security. Despite the outcry, the second pipeline, Nord Stream 2, was laid in 2021 but never certified. Sanctions and political pressure kept it idle, freezing the expansion just as a new energy crisis loomed. The bypass logic had redrawn the map, shifting leverage from transit states to direct supplier-consumer ties, but at the cost of deepening internal EU divisions. The next chapter would see new routes, this time to the south, competing to define Europe's energy future. The Black Sea and Anatolian corridors changed the rules for Europe's energy map. When Turkstream launched in 2020, it carried up to 31.5 billion cubic meters of Russian gas per year directly into Turkey. This was not just a new pipe, it was a new axis of influence. Instead of relying on the old Ukrainian route, gas now flowed south, entering the Balkans and Central Europe through a Turkish-controlled gateway. Turkey's ambitions did not stop there. The Trans-Anatolian Natural Gas Pipeline, or TANAP, opened a parallel channel from Azerbaijan, with a capacity of 16 billion cubic meters per year. By connecting to the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, TANAP pushed Caspian gas straight into Italy, bypassing the old Soviet corridors entirely. Turkish energy firms, working with Russian and Azerbaijani partners, positioned themselves as brokers, not just transit states. Suddenly, Ankara could negotiate with Moscow, Baku, and Brussels from a position of strength. Every cubic meter that passed through Turkish territory gave it greater leverage in regional politics and energy pricing. The southern corridor did not erase dependency, it spread it across new borders. As the 2022 shock would soon show, shifting the flow lines only changed where the pressure built up next. On a September morning in 2022, explosions tore through the Nord Stream pipelines beneath the Baltic Sea. Official investigations from Sweden, Denmark, and Germany each called it sabotage. Suddenly, decades of energy planning unraveled in a single day. Within weeks, gas prices in Europe soared to €120 per megawatt hour, forcing governments and industries into emergency mode. By early 2024, liquefied natural gas had filled about a quarter of the continent's supply, up from just 10% 2 years earlier. Ports from Rotterdam to Świnoujście raced to add new import terminals, rerouting tankers from the United States, Qatar, and Nigeria. But the story did not end with new ships or terminals. Germany's industrial backbone felt the shock most directly. BASF, the world's largest chemical producer, faced a 15% jump in costs almost overnight. Unable to rely on cheap pipeline gas, the company switched to oil-based feedstocks and began investing in hydrogen projects, betting on a different kind of energy future. Even as Europe scrambled to replace Russian gas, new dependencies surfaced. The push for renewables and hydrogen drew the continent into a global race for critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, and rare earths, most of which come from far beyond Europe's borders. The 2022 rupture exposed the old vulnerabilities, but the scramble to fix them revealed something deeper. Every solution trades one dependency for another. The grid may be changing, but the logic of leverage remains. Europe's new energy map is still under construction. As gas pipelines lose dominance, fresh dependencies on critical minerals, grids, and digital infrastructure rise to take their place. Power never flows in a vacuum. Who builds tomorrow's networks will shape the continent's choices long after the fuel itself has changed.